Welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. Thrilled to be with you today, celebrating Juneteenth, which is now a holiday at Bard. We're not supposed to be working, but here we go. Couldn't think of a better way to celebrate it. We're reading Hannah Arendt's book of essays, edited by Jerome Cohn, the Essays in Understanding. It has a wide selection of interviews, essays, letters that she wrote from about 1930 until the 50s and up until I think around the 60s of Hannah Arendt's, posthumously edited together in this collection. We read last week the interview with Günter Gauss, which is an incredible way to start. These first three essays that I had you to read today that come after that, are, I would say, three unknown essays of Hannah Arendt's. They're from a period in her life when she's still a graduate student. They're all, I think they all bear to some degree the marks of that period of her life. She's living in Berlin. She's trying to make it. She's as a writer, as she also is writing her Habilitation on Rahel Varnhagen. And it's before she obviously has to flee Germany and make it to Paris and then eventually to the United States. One of the things we talked about in the interview with Günter Gauss last week is how Arendt denies being a philosopher. And, Gauss says, well, I think of you as a philosopher. She says, well, I'm not. I gave that up. She's writing these essays at a period where it's not entirely clear whether she would have said that she's not a philosopher. Especially in the essay Philosophy and Sociology, she is defending a kind of philosophy, and we'll have to get into that, against what she sees as the attack on philosophy launched by Karl Mannheim through his idea of sociology. So I thought I'd give a quick, I'm going to focus primarily on the essay Philosophy and Sociology, because I think that's the most substantial of the three. And if you have questions about either the other two, we can address them. I'll say a little bit about the opening essay on Augustine and Protestantism, because I think all three of these essays in a way go together in an important way. This essay was published in 1930 in Frankfurter Zeitung on the 1500th anniversary of Augustine's death. And Arendt poses a very simple question. Now, remember, she's a Jewish thinker in Germany studying with two great Protestant writers. And she asks, why is Augustine forgotten by Protestants, right? Why is he recognized by Catholics and not by Protestants? And she tells a story here that it wasn't always so, and that I think she's trying to make the case that Augustine is important for Protestants. Now, we also have to remember Arendt wrote her dissertation on Augustine. And so in claiming him for Protestants, she's also, I think, going to claim him for philosophy and for what she does. So she says that his book, The Confessions, explores the empire of the inner life. And, for those of you who've not read it or read it and don't remember, it's, a long history of all of his different attempts to think and join different philosophical schools and search, but also, his stealing a pear from a pear tree and sins that he's committed. And it's a reckoning with his life of sin and heresy and being a heretic. And she says that the beauty of the Confessions is that it is a book in which someone tells their life story such that that life story acquires meaning, right? That's going to be the word and the idea that unites these three essays that we're reading today, and that really is so important in Arendt studies and thinking about Arendt, and honestly not understood well enough, right? I mean, people talk about spontaneity or natality or freedom, all important in Arendt. Talk about politics, meaning, the question of what it means to be alive, what it means to be human, what is the meaning of life, is really at the absolute core of Arendt's work throughout her life. So, jump ahead all the way to her last book, The Life of the Mind, where she's going to talk about thinking. And what is she going to say about thinking? She's going to say that thinking doesn't pursue truth. It seeks meaning. So, these are some of the earliest writings we have of Arendt, and we're going to see this really incredible arc that connects her earliest writing with some of her latest writing around this question of meaning. And so, she did her early work on Augustine, and what she finds in Augustine is an attempt to remember his life, memory of, it's a book of memories, and he remembers his sins, but he also remembers his sins to give them a story. So he remembers his sins to give them a story that ends in redemption. And it's that story that he tells about himself, that Augustine tells about himself, that is what matters, right? She says, it doesn't matter if the story is true. People say, oh, well, Augustine lied or he made things up. She's like, none of that matters. What matters is that he tells a story that has meaning, and that there are two kinds of stories that we can imagine Christians telling about, that give their life meaning over time. One is the Augustinian story, such that the individual who confesses is thrown back into the loneliness of his inner life. And that inner life and his loneliness and his sins are revealed before God, and he confesses and is redeemed. And in doing so, it is an exemplary story. It is a warning to live in sin and a testament to the glory of God who forgives. But in both cases, it comes out of a personal telling of my story to God. The second kind of story is the confessional, in which the church intercedes between the self and God. And you tell to the priest, who then is the authority that intermediates between you and God. And she says what Luther opposed in Catholicism, again, this is her reading, right, was the intermediary of the church. And that what he sought to bring back was a direct relationship between the believer's conscience and God. And so she says that's what's important about Augustine, is that he stands for the principle of telling a story in which your life acquires meaning, and you tell it to God. Now, Augustine was not a modern person. He was religious, he believed in God. And so she says this is not the same as a modern novel or a modern identity crisis. And yet he is in many ways the model and the progenitor for the modern psychological novel, where we don't confess to God or to the church. We simply confess to ourselves, and we try and, through our own self-confessions, in a sense, compose a life for ourselves and give ourselves a life that has meaning. And so that, again, in this little few pages on Augustine and Protestantism, so much of her interest on storytelling, on meaning, on modernity is going to come out and in that little essay, and it's going to connect, I think, importantly, with this longer and a little bit drier and more difficult essay on philosophy and sociology. So here she's reviewing Karl Mannheim's book Ideology and Utopia, and this review is published in 1930. You know, the argument here is that Mannheim, as a sociologist, is doing two things in this book that she's interested in. One is offering a theoretical basis for sociology as opposed to philosophy, and two, elevating sociology above philosophy based on those theoretical claims. Now, what's going to be the crux? What's going to be the issue here? Well, it's going to turn out to be meaning again. So let's see how this works. The basic argument that Mannheim makes, as Arendt reconstruction, is that all thought is bound to a situation, bound to a concrete social and economic reality. Now, unlike a communist or socialist thinker like Lukács, she says, who challenges philosophy from the interest of the proletariat, Mannheim is going to challenge philosophy from what he considers to be no specific place of interest, from mere, we could call it objective sociology, if you're willing to accept that term for now. And so his claim is that there is a material basis for all thought. So whatever your thought is, whatever your thinking is, whether it's brotherly love or Christianity, or whether it's Buddhism, or whether it's white supremacy, or whether it's anti-racism, whatever your thought is, it doesn't come out of your brain some way. It comes out of social conditions, right? There's a material causal basis for all thought. And Mannheim then wants to say that all thought, as a result, is out of place. All thought is homeless and rootless, because what it does is it flees the material conditions from which it comes, and it even forgets them intentionally or unintentionally. And he says there's two ways that thinking becomes homeless. One is ideology and one is utopia. So what are these two ways? I have to do a little of this or you're not going to understand the text. Ideology it lends a kind of absolute authority to a past social situation in which the individual in question is still bound. So an example of this would be a religious Christian, right, today, who is still bound to Christian thought. Now, I'll say it. Any religious thinker today, whether it's Christian, Jewish, Buddhist, whatever it is, would be in Mannheim's sense an ideological thinker, because they have this sort of absolute idea, religious truth, that is connected to a past society that no longer fits within our own. And so you have to renounce a kind of interest in this world. I mean, almost like the Amish might in some way. And so you have to have this ideological rigidity to your thinking, and just say, we're not going to live in the modern world. It arises, and such a thinking, she says, arises from a false consciousness in which one is committed to ideas that had their source in a world that is no longer real. Okay, what is utopia? Utopia is also a kind of thought schema, like Christianity would be, like ideology is, but it's not one that is committed to an old world for which we romanticize, but a new one that would shatter partially or wholly, she writes, the order of things prevailing at this time in pursuit of some new order that it advocates. Thus, unlike an ideology, which is sort of like romantic world weariness, utopia seeks to change the world and to translate itself into reality. So for Mannheim, what all philosophy does, as either ideology or utopia, is to make absolute claims about truth or what is in reality, but that it forgets those material and social origins of those claims. Philosophy for Mannheim, and thus for sociology, is thus not really above everyday reality. It has material origins, but those material origins have been forgotten, right? Now, having understood philosophy in that way, thinking in that way, Arendt says, all right, well, what does Mannheim think the point of philosophy is? Point of thinking is either ideology or utopia. Well, what she thinks Mannheim thinks it is, she says, well, let's compare it to two other modern thinkers and see how he's different. And she compares it to her two teachers, Karl Jaspers and Martin Heidegger. And she says that for Jaspers, to think is to detach ourselves from the daily here and now and experience in a kind of absolute solitude existence, a border situation, this idea of existence, whatever that is, in which we are alone in solitude, and we can, having escaped the day-to-day, find something meaningful, right? Whereas against Jaspers, sociology says that to see such uniqueness, such solitude, such a border situation is actually not something special. It's just part of everyday life. And so these peak moments, this existence philosophy, these insights that someone like Jaspers would treasure for sociology are simply caused by specific historical and sociological laws that are valid for everybody and need to be explored through sociological science. Heidegger also understands that most of our human life lives in a sociological order, a reality, which he calls das Man, the they, in which we lose our identity into a public order. But Heidegger says there's a kind of extrication of ourself from that daily order, where we stand in a kind of clearing and we think, and in thinking exercise our humanity as beings who are not simply other beings, but are beings who can think and can ask the question, why are we here? What are we doing? What's our meaning? Right? Against Heidegger and Jaspers, Mannheim in sociology says we can never be free of the they. We're always part of a social order. And all thinking comes from that social order. So forget it. It's not that important. It's not interesting. And the question ceases to be, what's the meaning of us, to how does it come about? How do we understand these social conditions? And so it becomes a historical discipline in a way of teaching how particular social orders emerge and how they govern us. And she says, look, this could be a harmless methodological move, but she thinks it's not. She thinks it's a threat to all thinking and all philosophy. She says on page 32, it is a threat to philosophy when it claims that the world can only be investigated in its particulars and not as a formal structure of human existence. The sociology, she says, questions that there's such a thing as the human being, right? There is no human being. There's no way that humans be. I mean, to put it in a little bit of a Heideggerian or Jasperian way, there's no way that humans exist. Arendt also says in her book, The Human Condition, that there's no human nature. But the whole premise of the book, The Human Condition, is that there is a human condition. There's something about being human. And that we as conditioned beings have a kind of humanity. And what she sees in Mannheim and in sociology is the assertion that there is such a thing as being human. What Mannheim says is that whatever is constant in humanity is unimportant. What matters for Mannheim is simply the social existence, not a human, but the society, the sociology, the truth of the social. And it's this privileging of the social, that denies both individuality and, for Arendt, denies thinking. And in denying thinking, to go back to Augustine, we deny memory, my memory, and we deny my story, and thus we deny meaning. Meaning for sociology is simply the meaning of sociology, of the social order as it's emerged, in which we're a collective body, right? Gesellschaft. And so she's going to say that she gives, I think I'll skip a little. She says that there's 3 ways of understanding thinking, right? 2 that Mannheim recognizes and 1 that he doesn't. So this is going to be starting on pages 39 to 40. At the bottom of page 39. She says, one way of understanding thinking, and she's going to use the example of Christian brotherly love, right, is that brotherly love is an ideology if the religious man thinks he can realize it only in absolute transcendence, right? So if the only way to get to brotherly love is that is to transcend this world, leave it behind, and live in sort of a fantasy world of ideas, right? That's thinking as ideology. And Mannheim says that's bad. And Arendt largely doesn't think much of such a life. Brotherly love as utopia is when you seek to make a kingdom of God on earth and try and transform this earth into a brotherly love, a community based on brotherly love. And Mannheim says this is also unreal. And Arendt, I think, would agree with him on that. But then Arendt says at the bottom of page 39, and this is really where she enters this essay for the first time, or for the most meaningful time. She says, but there is a third possibility, that it is not an arbitrary special case, but namely brotherly love, but one absolutely crucial to the concept of brotherly love in early Christianity. This is the possibility of living in the world, but being guided by a transcendence that does not conceive of itself as realizable on earth. So to the possibility of living in the world, right? The world now being the social world, the social order, but being guided by a transcendence, a thinking, a thought that does not conceive of the world as realizable on earth. It's not utopian, nor is it ideological, because it's not like exiting the world. It's living in the world and being guided by it and living that way. And the example she gives here is St. Francis of Assisi, right? Who she says lived in the world as if it did not exist and realized this as if it did not exist in his concrete life. And that's a kind of way of, on the one hand, reconciling to the world as it is, still living in it, and yet not saying that we give up our freedom to think, and to make meaning and to make the world meaningful as human beings. And this is Arendt's real disagreement with sociology as Mannheim presents it, is that sociology, in denying all thinking any power, denies the power of man to impact the world. Man doesn't just impact the world through utopia or through exiting it, but by thinking, and in thinking, finding a remove from the world, a space, so that you live in the world and you also live out of it. And that, Arendt says, is the power of thinking. The example she gives at the end of this essay is really amazing and worth taking a second on. She talks about capitalism, right? And Max Weber and the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. And what she says is that what Weber understood is that capitalism emerged as a specific public order out of a specific kind of thinking. What kind of thinking? Protestant thinking. Go back to Augustine. What kind of Protestant thinking? The Protestant thinking that said that I, in my individual relationship with God, right, can't know whether I am saved, and yet and so what I have to do, and yet there will be signs, and the signs are whether I live a blessed life. And one way of living a blessed life is by being successful, doing my duty, and that means making money, but of course not spending it, not consuming, not being greedy. And so what Protestantism, in its remove from and connection with the world, what it does is it says there is an ethical relation to the world in which I work hard and do my duty and thus earn money, but I don't spend my money, and so I save it. And this leads to profit and capital, which leads to me being able to lend it out, which leads to capitalism. She says that's an example of the power of thinking to impact the world. But once the religious bond that started capitalism, that Weber says starts capitalism, is lost, the public order, namely capitalism, becomes so powerful that solitude is possible only in a flight from the world. And in such a situation that we are in today, she says, so Weber says it that's himself, and at the end of the essay, he says, we're now living, the world has been demagicalized, it's been rationalized, and we're now living in an iron cage because the very ethical spirit that motivated capitalism has been lost, and it's been replaced with simply profit, and that becomes a game, who can have the most, and there's no ethical basis to it. And so we're stuck in this world. And so Arendt says on page 41, we are at the mercy of a public order today that even our possibilities of detachment can be defined as only freedom from it. But she says this wasn't always the case, and that what sociology does is it binds us to this historical moment. So here's the argument she's going to make in the end. The sociological turn sees as universal, namely that reality is what the social situation and not thinking, what is in actuality a particular situation, namely a post-religious, post-metaphysical world in which thinking itself is now out of place. Our world is so dominated by economics and other social orders that we've reduced thinking to either ideology or utopia because there's nothing else that we can imagine thinking doing that's meaningful. And that what sociology does is simply accept that situation and say, so we don't need to think. Thinking is actually a negative. And Arendt's response to that is that it's precisely at the moment it's precisely at the moment when thinking has been made meaningless, when we are at the mercy of a social order that seems inescapable. It's at that moment that we need thinking, that we need somehow people who think, who will push us to find distance from that world, who will push us outside of that world, who will, if thinking is homeless in a world dominated by economic and social and reputational and status orders, only thinking can actually save us and push us to try and make meaning out of this world. And that's the sort of crux of this essay. The next essay on Kierkegaard, is short. Basically, what she's saying is Kierkegaard is one of these people, right? He's one of these people who was a Christian, wanted to live a Christian life in a world without Christianity. And what he does is he teaches us to think. So I'll stop there. I realized that this thinking and philosophy and sociology essay was hard. It was hard for me. it's not an essay widely read. I think I taught it once 10 years ago with a colleague who studies Mannheim. It's so I hope that I could make some sense of it for you, and we'll see where you guys do with it. Samantha, do you want to add anything before we open it up?
Yeah, I'll just add a couple of things on the Mannheim essay. So Hannah Arendt actually, because this is interesting and something I discovered while I was working on the biography, is that she was actually writing these essays while she was living in Frankfurt, as her first husband, Günther Anders, was working on his habilitation at the Institute for Social Research. And Hannah Arendt was taking classes with Mannheim at the time. And the editor of Die Gesellschaft, which was the journal for the Social Democratic Party, was a friend with Arendt's mother. And so through her mom, she got commissioned to write this critical review of Mannheim's essay. So Paul Tillich and Herbert Marcuse also contributed essays on this work by Mannheim, which was published in 1929. And Ideology and Utopia was a really important work when it came out, and it's still a really important work in the tradition of critical theory, and is about the sociology of knowledge. I think at the heart of Arendt's critique, which is very much informed by studying with Heidegger and Jaspers, is challenging. I see this is what's being discussed in the chat box, is challenging subjectivity, or the language of being, the kind of ontic and the ontological, right? So Arendt is very much using the language of Heidegger and Dasein, and also Jaspers and existence. And I think that's what makes this essay difficult to swim through. But she's saying that in order, she's questioning the veracity of Mannheim's claim about thinking as a handmaiden just to political action in the world, which is attendant to a set of specific political problems. And so she wants to think about thinking in relationship to being, while she's criticizing Mannheim's understanding of being, right? And this we see very much come through in much simpler language and a lot of Hannah Arendt's later work, which I think is what Roger was talking about at the end, and the way that she's thinking about thinking, which is something that is fundamentally worldly, right? And this is also what she gets out of Augustine through his conception of neighborly love. And caritas is a form of transcendence that exists within this world. And that is very closely related to the way that she's going to come and talk about thinking and the work on thinking at the end of her life. So just a couple of thoughts to add. There's a lot. I think this is actually an underread essay, and some of the debate between Arendt and Mannheim, which continued. They'd stayed friends throughout their lives, is really important to some of the turns that take place within the Frankfurt School tradition of critical theory.
So feel free to raise your hands if you have questions. I see it in the chat. Jason has a question from the Augustine essay that begins on page 28. It was falsifying memory that saved the reality for us. I mean, I talked a bit about that in the sense that for her, the point is to tell a story that's meaningful, whether it's false or true. And Jason writes, some trauma is best forgotten for the sake of healing mental health, but lessons lost we are doomed to relearn. It would seem continuity is limited to an abridged memory, typically the victor's. What is the tension between reconciliation and continuity? That's a great question. I've talked a fair bit about reconciliation, which is a major theme in some of Hannah Arendt's work, and is to some degree a theme here as well. Reconciliation is to love the world and to accept even evil in the world, but not forgive it. And so maybe this is the distinction you're making between continuity and reconciliation. It's to not embrace it and say we want it. It's simply to say, I can accept some sin. I stole a pear from the pear tree when I was a kid. And not ask that I keep stealing it, continuity, but I can accept that that sin is part of a life that I can reconcile with as someone who in the end will accept God, to use the Augustinian term. For Arendt, there's also going to be a certain, what she calls a limit. What is it she call it? She calls it a, I'm forgetting the word, but there's going to be some limit to where you can no longer either continue or reconcile, right? And at that point, you have to, in a sense, expel. That's the limit, of someone like Adolf Eichmann, right? You can't forgive Eichmann, and you can't reconcile with Eichmann. You have to actually say, a world in which someone like Eichmann is in it is one we just have to deny. Not in the sense that we don't understand it, but we understand it and we exclude it, and that's why we kill him. Just because Jason brought up the psychological, if it's all right, one of the things that these texts all share is an interest in psychology. I don't know exactly. Arendt is arguing against psychology this whole time. I assume a lot of this comes from Jaspers. Sam may have more input on that. But a number of the places in this text, she's trying to distinguish psychology both from what she's doing and what from others are doing. So on page 27, she's going to say that the Confessions has no psychological intent, but that it is in some way the beginnings of the modern psychological novel, in the sense that it's about autonomy and self-development. On page 33, she's talking about Mannheim's attempt at destructuring, which is a word she's using here, but basically it means that showing the way that philosophy and thinking is based on a false consciousness, differs from that of psychoanalysis, which also claims to penetrate to a more original reality. So again, the claim of sociology is that we focus on reality, what is, whereas philosophy is stuck in ideas that are an escape from reality. And she says in two respects. First, that in sociology, the situation-bound validity of the mental world is to a certain extent preserved, right? So in sociology, we are in a situation, whereas in psychology, which regards everything as mental or intellectual, repression or sublimation, it's sort of like philosophy in one sense, that it's not based in the sort of social concrete world. But second, and this is the more important point for Arendt, because this is where philosophy will differ from psychology, the reality for the sake of which psychoanalysis does its destructuring is totally alien to meaning and thought, right? Back to the question of meaning and thought. Psychology, insofar as it is fundamentally based in sublimation, in unconsciousness, in repression, in non-conscious, and thus, and here's the key word for Arendt, unfree thinking, right? Insofar as psychoanalysis is not a practice of human freedom, it doesn't engage in the creation of meaning and thought. And this is, this is one of the most common questions I get from people is, why does Arendt not like psychoanalysis, right? This is one of the key reasons, because for her, psychoanalysis denies freedom and thus denies meaning. As she says, sociology does its destructuring precisely in terms of historical, in terms of what still or once was within the realm of human freedom. Whereas psychoanalysis does its destructuring in a realm alien to meaning and thought, and one in which the human beings do not have and never have had control. So it's this loss of meaning and freedom and control that Arendt finds problematic about psychoanalysis. Jason, did you want to add anything there or respond in any way?
Am I on?
Yeah, you're on.
I think I probably asked the wrong question now that I've heard how you've broken it down.
Or maybe I answered the wrong question.
No, I don't think so, because it really comes down to me. I was talking about reconciliation versus continuity, and it's much more along the lines of continuity overrides. And what I probably should be talking about is reconciliation versus nostalgia. Those are more kind of on the opposite ends of a spectrum, and continuity kind of governs both. And I'm definitely looking at it, you're right, from the perspective of a monad, a singular element, as opposed to a psychological, or as opposed to a sociological. So no, I think that actually helps me clarify. It actually answered the question very succinctly, because it wasn't the right question. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Samantha, did you want to add anything or not?
I think George raised his hand. I can wait.
Okay. Can you unmute George?
Yep. And then Amori also has his hand up. You still have the unmute power.
Oh,
I do not have the unmute power.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
I just tried to unmute George. Let's see if it happens. Yeah. Go ahead, George.
Hello.
Hi.
Question about thinking, and you ended with psychoanalysis, but there's been a lot of thinking about thinking since psychoanalysis. So my question is, it seems to me that what we're talking about here, and what Arendt was talking about, and certainly in her time it was reasonable, is the aspect of cognitive agency. That is still the Cartesian ego that's not influenced by subconsciousness, it's not influenced by society, it can sort of go outside of it. But there's also a bodily aspect in there. The old William James question, do we run from the bear because we're afraid, or are we afraid because we run from the bear? And the whole thing is, in modern evolutionary psychiatry, cognitive science, there's the bodily aspects of experience that I don't know if I sort of think Heidegger in a very weird way addresses it. I don't know whether Arendt does. I mean, Arendt thinks that, an individual is a cognitive agent and can escape not only society, but can escape the influences of the body and the agency, the influence of the environment. Maybe somebody wants to comment on that.
Let me just try and understand the question, George. You're asking in some sense of where does thinking come from? If I'm getting the question, I mean, if I'm an American who's white and Jewish and in a basement, how is my thinking going to differ from a Bangladeshi in Bangladesh, a woman? Is that the question you're asking?
Not really. What I'm asking is there a little homunculus inside somebody's mind, whatever that is, that does the thinking, or is thinking inactivated by not only social space, by environment, by affordances?
I think I understand, George. Can I give it? So Hannah Arendt says in an interview in 1972, it's one of my favorite quotes. She says, "Where does thinking come from? Experience, nothing else." And this is a very important and central political claim to Arendt's work. All thinking moves from experience in the world. So to the last 2 points of your question, in the human condition, one of the things that she makes very clear is that the body, right, pain, when the body is in pain, we actually can't express that. We can't speak from it. It's not a shared experience. She literally, I mean, so I'm going to be a little playful here. You cannot feel another person's pain. And sorry, Bill Clinton. And, you know, there are certain experiences that we have that are embodied that cannot appear in the world outside of us as a source of common human experience. So thinking as an activity that we engage in for Arendt is always invisible. It occurs in the invisible space of the mind. And when we engage in the thinking activity, we represent our experiences to ourselves in our imagination, and we tell stories to ourselves about those experiences. And then in order to make thinking appear in the world, we have to engage in some practical activity, she says, by transforming it into a thought thing, into an object that can exist in the world outside of us. So there's two senses of experience and thinking here. One is the way in which we think about our own personal experiences and the way in which thinking moves from our experiences in the world. And the other is collective experience, which is necessary for common sense, which is necessary for a viable and vibrant public realm of politics. So the murder of George Floyd has become a collective experience. And because of plurality, because you and I and anybody who ever was and anybody who ever will be will never be the same or think the same or have the same set of experiences, we all experience that event differently. But we have a common experience that we can come together and talk about. Now, if we were to try to negate that common experience, that would rip away at the fabric of public life. And this is why lying in politics is so dangerous in Arendt's work, right? That we have to hold on to these collective experiences.
Sure. Can I speak?
So we have David and Amori and who have raised their hand. So Roger, you can.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Oh, Amori was next, so let me let
Sure.
Amori speak, and then David, you'll come in.
Hi. Hello. I think Josh wanted to add something to what Samantha said. I don't know if you want to give him back the word.
George, you want to add something?
No, I think that was a very nice explanation.
I mean,
I'm happy to talk about it, George.
you know, the one, I mean, it was a great, the one thing I think we could add is the place of metaphor, right?
So metaphor is one of the ways in which we transform thinking into something that appears in the world that can give voice to experience. Metaphor is metaphorine, literally means the bridging over from the invisible realm of thinking into the physical world of appearances. Poetry is also another example of how we make thinking appear for Arendt. Artworks, but not expressionist artworks. Very importantly for her, those don't count.
Yeah, but metaphor goes both ways, because not only does it bridge the invisible world of thinking backwards, but, and this goes to George's question, all thinking for Arendt comes out of, as Samantha said, experience, but comes out of is a metaphorical transformation of experience by someone's thought into concepts or ideas. There are no sort of Platonic high-flying concepts or ideas for Arendt. It's all a poetic, and this is why poetry is so important in this, transformation of, as she says, ash to flame, quoting the poem by Rainer Maria Rilke, that the magic of thinking is how you take ash, a concrete thing, and transform it into flame. And that's the sort of magic that Rilke talks about, that for Arendt is the power of thinking. So but how that happens is obviously unclear. She doesn't have a theory of that, but she does have a strong sense that all thinking is rooted in the experiential world. So just important to highlight that.
I mean, just to add very quickly, you know, to add answer to George's question, I think also is in the chat box now, is that, you know, Arendt does see similarities between ideology and psychoanalysis. The closest example I can think of is the example of racism that she gives in The Origins of Totalitarianism, where she argues that racism has become so prevalent in contemporary society that people who hold racist opinions don't hold them freely because it's so pervasive within society. So ideology is a way of unthinking. Psychoanalysis doesn't, you know, in thinking about sublimation and thinking about the Freudian framework of repression, and that, you know, for Arendt turns away from self-conscious reflective thinking by trying to, you know, liberate the unconscious. And so that's also part of her critique of Mannheim.
Amore.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Roger and Sam. Just a quick question, because I think it's Bob Meyerson. He was asking about whether we can talk about the critique of Mannheim without all the concepts of Heidegger about ontologically. I'm not quite sure, but I didn't want to have like this virtual reading group without addressing that issue. And the question will be how important is for Hannah Arendt to take into account the works of Heidegger and Jaspers, especially about existing or the being of being, in order to critique that the only thing that matters for sociology is the they and the group as a way of existing. So I think that will be all. Thank you.
You know, I guess I hoped I had done some of that, but maybe I didn't, or I'll try again. You know, I don't think you need Heidegger or Jaspers at all in this essay. I mean, she uses them for a very particular purpose, and obviously the language is in there. She's still a student, and we all know, no offense to any graduate students, we were all there. Graduate students get caught up in often the language of their teachers or of their whatever, their mentors. But you can take this, I think, very simply outside the language of Heidegger and Jaspers and put it in, as I tried to do, I hope good English and maybe Arendtian English, which is that what's really at issue here is the human freedom to think, to magically create ideas that distance ourselves from the world, that allow new ideas that don't come from nowhere, George, right? Come from experience, come from ash, that are based in the world, to suddenly pop up and enter the world and have those ideas sometimes fade away, but sometimes stick around and change the world, whether it's Protestantism or whether it's Black Lives Matter or I Can't Breathe. And what Arendt is worried about, right, is what she considers to be the underlying framework, the theoretical basis, and the then polemical frame of sociology. Mannheim is simply a stand-in here for sociological thinking. For all, I'll widen it. Mannheim is only a stand-in here for the social sciences, for what she sees as the danger of the rise of the social sciences against the humanities. This is an essay in which she's defending the humanities against the social sciences. And the reason and the argument is that what the social sciences do is assume that everything simply comes from a social situation, from the real social and economic phenomena, and that thoughts are simply emergent from that are either out of place ideologically, namely nostalgic for the past, or utopian, trying to bring some utopia to the future, and are therefore always out of place and not meaningful. And Arendt is saying that the great role of the humanities is to be the home for thinking, which seeks new thoughts and thinking that can be the home for meaning in the world. And that especially in an age like ours, a sociological age, in which in our sociological time, we are bound to a historical moment where thinking is out of place, we need to redouble our efforts to make the world hospitable to that kind of meaning-creating thinking that doesn't seek truth, it doesn't seek reality, but seeks meaning. And that Mannheim's degradation of thinking is dangerous precisely in its making the world, even in its confirmation of the world, in its inhospitability to thinking. So that's what I take to be. I hope that's in simple language. I didn't use Heidegger. I didn't use Jaspers. Does that do it? Amore.
Yes.
I mean,
no, it was great. The only thing is that it always keeps reminding me the first Heidegger when you said that we cannot be as, since we are not thinking things, but only beings that think and look for meaning, and that always click into that first Heidegger language. But I think your explanation is pretty good, so I'm convinced. So Bob in the chat is right. We can do this without the Heideggerian language.
Yeah, Bob, I'll recognize you if you want to add anything, because I know this was also your question in the chat. Do you want to add anything to that?
I think both of you put it very well. Thank you.
Okay. David, I'm sorry. Hold on. I thought I unmuted you, but I got it. Why are you?
Okay, muted? Is that all right?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I was thinking about what is hanging over all this, as I understand it, is the relationship between being and consciousness. And a naive question would be, does being create consciousness, or does consciousness create being? And if one takes it naively, then one would say that the naive sociologist says that being creates consciousness. And the naive philosopher will say consciousness creates being. But these are both naive because they're being absolutist. And what's missing, which I think is present in Arendt and I think probably in Mannheim, is not this absolutist position, but a dialectical position. That is that being creates consciousness and consciousness creates being. That capital creates the conditions for Protestantism and Protestantism creates the conditions for capital. So I think I like the idea of Mannheim's unmasking, that through seeing the social conditions which forms of thinking represent that we didn't know, doesn't necessarily mean that's it, that's the whole story, that's the determination. And I think Arendt quotes Mannheim saying that we can understand the determination, but that's not the same thing as saying whether it's true or not. There's an independent, if you like, truth content. So, and certain eras may be more able to see certain truths other than other eras. And I think the same also goes for psychology or psychoanalysis. Of course, there is a degraded reductionist form of psychoanalysis, which believes that it's thinking that creates the world. But that's not the way that most psychoanalysts think. We're always on the relation between experience and thought. And there's no absolutist the unconscious. There are constant movements between levels of unconsciousness. But what we seek to do is to help people have a little more understanding of the, if you like, predeterminations can become known determinants. And to some extent can be minimally transcended, not completely, can be minimally transcended. And therefore it is, I think, a sense of freedom. I think the last thing, which is maybe connected, is to say that although it may be true in some ultimate sense that forms of psychology and forms of social existence are creating our consciousness, that mustn't lead to a kind of casual giving up. I think it is a necessary part of what it is to be a human, is to struggle with that knowledge in the attempt to transcend them. We may never transcend them, but I think it's an essential part of what it is to be human, to both accept those things and also not accept them in some casual way.
I think that last point I certainly share. I'm going to accept that mostly as a comment, which is great. I mean, the being versus consciousness, I have to admit I didn't quite follow David. I you know, that just might be me. I have trouble with that kind of language. But and I'd be wary of turning Arendt into a dialectical thinker, which I don't think she is. But these are minor issues.
Arendt does reject dialectics, but David, if you know, I think the place to go to think about the way Arendt discusses being and consciousness would be the human condition, where she says very explicitly that everything that beings encounter in the world immediately becomes a condition of their existence. And so it's, you know, I think what she does is she has this kind of uncomfortable materialist phenomenology. That, you know, she's using the word condition in at least 3 senses, right? That there is a human condition, that we are conditioned by the materiality of the world that we encounter from the moment of our appearance, and we're conditioned by the fact of plurality, that we coexist with other beings. So from the moment we appear, we are already conditioned by what it is we come into contact with. And that is actually very key to what she describes as the dismantling of metaphysics in the later work on the life of the mind, because you see her there departing not just from Heidegger, but also Plato and Aristotle.
Great.
Can I just add something there? It's just fascinating that I don't know whether he knows of these connections are manifest, but Laplanche,
yeah,
one of his primary contributions is the idea is that the infant comes into the preformed world of the mother's fantasy of what that infant is, and that the first human struggle is to find having to accept that that's part of what it is to become, but also an attempt to escape it.
Yeah, no, I would be happy to have that conversation with you, because I think Laplanche is a very interesting reader of Freud, and there is a lot to talk about there, but I'm not sure this is the space to do it. So I'm happy to have that conversation.
It's a great one, and by the way, I mean, Arendt's essay on education, in which she sees education as a struggle between a child who needs to and wants to change the world, and they have to be protected from the world, which would destroy them, the fantasy, but also the world, which needs to be protected from the child, which would destroy it. and needs to be held on to. Again, I don't think that's dialectical, but for Arendt, that's the experiential basis for what does it mean to lead someone into the world, which is what education is, educadere, to lead someone into the world. So highly recommend that. Dina, you're up next.
On page 41, Arendt writes, the interpretation of mental life purely in terms of reducing to ideology or utopia is justified only when the economic component has gained such predominance in life that thought, in fact, can and must become ideological superstructure. And I'm wondering, some have argued that we've arrived at this point, that it's place of hypercapitalism. What would be Arendt's response? So is there a way to, under an Arendtian framework, to determine whether or not we exist in this moment now that she describes here?
Well, yes. Go ahead. Do you want to add something?
Which some may have called hypercapitalism.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I think she's trying to say is that in such a world, if you're calling it hypercapitalism, I mean, she would just call it capitalism shorn of its ethical and religious backbone. The sociological approach to such a world, which says that that all thinking is either ideology or utopia, in a sense, reduces all thinking to a kind of false consciousness, or ideological superstructure is the word she'll use here. For her, the whole premise of her work is that can't happen. The very idea that man is a beginner, which she takes from Augustine. How does man begin? He begins, or she begins, man begins, human begins by thinking. And, in thinking, we transform this world into a new thought world. And in doing so, a new thing enters the world, a new idea, a new thought. Most of those new thoughts are soon forgotten, if ever even paid attention to. But I think Arendt's hopefulness, and she is a hopeful thinker in many ways, is that some of those thought things that we create catch on and become public thought things that other people talk about, and then become part of the public world, and over time enter that public world and change the world. And so I think the premise here is that kind of thinking, and an openness to that kind of thinking is always timely and always needed. And that's the argument I think she's making against Mannheim. But maybe I'm not seeing your question, Dina, so why don't you follow up?
I just based on this sentence, and given the fact that she must have been 24, 25 when she wrote this particular essay, she may have been more cynical than she was later on, because it seems to me, based on this structure, that based on this sentence alone, which might be a little unfair to rip out of the whole essay, that her view here is that when the economic component becomes so predominant, thought is reduced to being nothing but an ideological superstructure. She may have changed her mind later on, but at this point in her life.
I think here she's speaking for Mannheim, not for herself.
Okay.
So she's saying sociology is bound to a historical moment. As a historical discipline, it can operate only within the given limits of its historical competence. The interpretation of mental life. So the sociological interpretation of mental life purely in terms of reducing it to ideology and utopia is justified. This is not her. This is her reading of Mannheim. You want to read her, skip down to the bottom of the page, and when she says, you know, so right after footnote 46, about a third of the way up from the bottom, only when people no longer see their existence and community as given. So only when they can see that they might have another possibility, right? Only when, as by means of economic advancement, the individual suddenly finds himself belonging to a completely different community, does something like ideology arise as a justification of one's own position against the position of others. Only at this point does the question of meaning arise, a question born of the questionableness of one's own situation. Only when the individual's place in the world is determined by economic status and not by tradition does he become homeless. And only in this homelessness can the question of the rightfulness and meaning of his position emerge. This question of meaning is, however, older than capitalism. So it's at points of when things become really solidified and homeless, that suddenly homelessness can become a question, and meaning can become a question. That's her response to Mannheim and to sociology and to the social studies, social science.
But Roger, I think I disagree with the first part of that, because I actually read her as picking up this critique in part in I mean, she's rejecting the temporal.
I do too.
She's rejecting the temporal structure that Mannheim is employing, going back to Augustine to think about a now that's oriented in this world. But, you know, this critique of what happens when economy becomes the driving force in society, she picks up in The Human Condition, and she picks it up in On Revolution, and in a number of other essays to talk about the dangers of individualism that rise concomitantly in the modern world with forms of new capitalist development that tear away at the collective and the community and the public sphere, that lead to the privatization of politics and origins of totalitarianism. And in The Human Condition, she talks about how we now live in a world where everything is fueled by what she calls the waste economy, where all activity is now a matter of production for the sake of production and just for consumption and production. And that's, you know, that's where we get into the stickiness of what she's taking from Marx and where she's turning away from Marx, which I think is, you know, when she's writing this essay, she's reading Marx, she's reading Trotsky, she's reading Lenin. You know, this is also an interesting essay in the body of her work, because this is probably one of, you know, at the point where she's actually coming into her political consciousness, and she's reading in this tradition of Marxism at the time. And I think this critique stays with her. I think she does different things with it than Mannheim, but I don't think she's rejecting it. Sorry, Dina.
I agree. And so if I would just say, if in fact we're not reduced to nothing but consuming, can we still be homeless?
Yeah.
And in fact, arguably, if all we're doing is consuming, we're in fact not homeless in the way that, you know, we need to be thinking.
Yeah, well, I guess I disagree with those readings. You know, this is not a defense of capitalism or consumption that she's making. I don't see that at all. But it is a defense of thinking, and and it's a rejection of what I take to be the sociological claim that there are societal situations, bounded situations, in which thinking cannot happen, and thinking will become simply ideological superstructure, and there's no way out. I don't see anywhere in any of Arendt's writings where she takes that position. And to suggest that she sees capitalism as an unavoidable, inescapable destiny of of man is, I think, simply not right from an Arendtian point of view.
No, but she says she says as late as she says as late as 1973 that, you know, the logical development of capitalism is socialism, and that at least Marx got the development of capitalism right. What she doesn't share is Marx's faith in capitalism to deliver us to a more just society. But she's having a fight with Jaspers at the time about whether or not justice or freedom is fundamentally at the heart of Marx's writing. You know, she's very critical of capitalism consistently from her early writing till the very end of her life as a socioeconomic structure. I think where I agree with you, Roger, is, you know, in the sense that she's rejecting the determinist impulse in Mannheim's writing here to locate thinking at this kind of, and this is the ontological intervention, that you know, all thinking moves from the certain moment of where historical and material forces produce a certain subjectivity that has been produced by the social and economic and political forces in society. Arendt's going to consistently reject that kind of ontological foundation for subjectivity throughout her work as well. So she keeps the critique of capitalism, but she rejects reducing a person to a predetermined subject.
Yeah, I mean, I was not making a I don't see this as about capitalism, but I mean, we can read it again. The primacy of the economic power structure in reality has its own history and is part of the history of modern thought. Groups of pre-capitalist origin in which the communal element prevails may be held together by traditions or by common sentiments alone. In such a group, theoretical reflection is of entirely secondary importance, right? So even in pre-capitalist groups, right, thinking, theoretical reflection is secondary. On the other hand, in groups which are not welded together primarily by such organic bonds of community life, but which merely occupy similar positions of social economic system, rigorous theorizing is a prerequisite of cohesion. This is all Mannheim. Only when, this is now Arendt, only when people no longer see their existence in community as given. So communities break down, right? Only when, as by means of economic advancement, the individual suddenly finds himself belonging to a completely different community. So kind of capitalist, you know, idea where you can change you move from status to contract in the Sir Henry Maine idea. So you lose the idea that you're bound by tradition and you can actually change who you are. So only in that kind of world does something like ideology arise as a justification of one's own position against the position of others. So we justify ourselves versus others. Only at this point does the question of meaning arise, a question born of the questionableness of one's own situation. Only when the individual's place in the world is determined by economic status and not by tradition does he become homeless. And only in this homelessness can the question of the rightfulness and meaning of his position emerge. This question of meaning is, however, older than capitalism itself because it goes back to an earlier experience of human insecurity in the world, that is, to Christianity. The concept of ideology, indeed the fact of ideological thinking, points to a positive factor, the ideological thinking, to the question of meaning. So, I mean, you know, I don't see any other way to read this. The point is that in strong community thinking, in strong pre-capitalist communities, where people largely are governed by status, they generally don't think. Capitalism, for all of its bad stuff, right, creates a kind of insecurity and homelessness, which raises the question of thinking and meaning, as did Christianity, and thus have positive elements to them. To continue, reduction of this question to the more original reality of economic life becomes possible only when the world and life of human beings are indeed primarily determined by economic factors. So once capitalism loses its ethical and thoughtful and spiritual elements, as it had in the Weberian understanding in its origin, once it ceases to be an innovative and becomes a dead kind of static social system, then human beings are indeed primarily determined by economic factors. And when the reality of which mental life is bound has become fundamental alien to thought and meaning. And in that kind of a case, there's sort of a way in which capitalism ceases to be a kind of insecurity and becomes a kind of trap, a kind of game in which you just play it and there's no thinking. Originally, this was not the case in sociology, as it was from the start in the psychoanalytic conception of reality. Before we can pose Mannheim's question concerning the social and historical locus of sociological inquiry, we need to inquire first into the existential situation in which sociological analyses are historically legitimate. So again, I take this to be a fairly strong claim that the danger of sociology is that it accepts the social situation as it is and denies all thinking as either ideology or utopia from it. And that is particularly that sociology emerges at a particular historical moment of what you would call, Dina, hyper-capitalism, at which thinking is completely out of place and not acceptable. I take that to be her point. Again, I'm happy to have people disagree with me, but I don't see anywhere in here where another point. I mean, this is not really about capitalism, except insofar as capitalism, in its original sense, brings a kind of innovation and thus insecurity into the world, which leads to thinking, and in its current modern sense, is completely opposed to thinking. I don't take this to be engaged in the Marxist question in any way, shape, or form.
It very much is, and I think to fully appreciate the Mannheim essay, to understand what Mannheim is doing in this work and why it's so pivotal. One of the things that Mannheim is doing is engaging with Georg Lukács, who is one of the kind of fathers of the Institute for Social Research. And he's critiquing precisely this point in Lukács's work in order to offer a different kind of sociological understanding. And with 5 minutes left, I don't think I should launch into an explanation of what Lukács says and how Mannheim is critiquing him. But this work and Arendt's critique of this work fits, very squarely in a tradition of Marxist and neo-Marxist literature that traces the development of society from pre-capitalism to capitalism to future visions of utopia that have emerged out of them. And Arendt's intervention in writing this critique is she's not rejecting the critique of capitalism and the effect it has on society. She's rejecting that placing of sociology as emergent from a specific point and bounded by a specific political temporality between past and future, between ideology and utopia. And, again, this remains consistent in her work, as somebody she's a phenomenologist to a certain extent. She's never going to move from that kind of fixed temporal framework in her thinking. So she's trying to give us, I think, that critique. It's not a rejection of Mannheim. She's engaging with it and building from it in this way. And I think in that sense, it's actually a really, important. I think it's an interesting piece to read, but there are like 10 hands up in the chat box. So maybe we should try and power through.
Oh, I don't see. Okay, I didn't see the hands. Let's see. There's Vala Mati. It's up. You're up. I just unmuting you now.
Thank you, Roger. I really enjoyed this discussion. This is very dense discussion going on over here, and I think I may be deviating from this what we were discussing all through this time. My question is totally different from what the discussion has been thus far.
Good.
So in the article on essay on Augustine, there is one line which caught my eye. I think it's in page number, the final page of the article, the end of the article. With increasing secularization, religious self-reflection before God lost its meaning. That's what caught my eye. And also in the article, in the essay on Mannheim, she refers to Max Weber's essay on Protestantism and the rise of capitalism. What my hello.
Where was the first quotation you gave? Oh, I see.
End of the Augustine essay. Yeah, end of the with increasing secularization, religious self-reflection before God lost its meaning.
Yeah.
She also almost the essay on Mannheim also. She also refers to Max Weber's essay, which is closely related to this line. My question is, we are in the middle of a pandemic, right? And the question of this particular idea, this particular point with increasing secularization, religious self-reflection before God lost its meaning, has very according to let me I have to refer to I can't quote the pages or any lines from the work, but you must most of us must be aware of William McNeill's Plagues and People, in which he and later on other works which refers to which has written about the history of pandemics. They have noted the point that the Black Death, the pandemic of Black Death, had an effect on this kind of confessions.
Kind of what?
Confessions in the Christian tradition, which actually lost its meaning when the priests were dying because of the pandemic. The common people, they had to go to the priests to confess the sins. And at a time of pandemic, where there were people who were dying in trolls, and there only place to go is the priest in the situation in the Middle Ages. But they saw that the priests were dying because of the pandemic. And so this had a very direct effect on the loss of meaning for the Christian world, in which they can go to the priests and confess. And this had a very direct relationship in the rise of Protestantism, in the rise of Luther's thoughts. So there is a very close relationship between pandemic and the loss of meaning of faith in the Christian world, in the West, in the Europe in particular. We can't. I don't know how to say this. I'm not. I'm sorry if my question is not so directly related to this ongoing discussion. This is. I have to apologize. This is a totally divergent question. How to make sense of this thing? That's my question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's actually quite related in an important way with the discussion we've been having. What I think there's a question of how one can or cannot think within a world, you know, that, as you said, has, well, lost its religion, or in this pandemic world in which almost everything has been reduced. I take this to be somewhat your point, to a concern with life. And maybe this is a chance to talk a little bit about Kierkegaard. We haven't talked as much about that essay. She sees Kierkegaard as someone who speaks for an entire generation. She says, "Mea res agitor," it concerns me. And what she, I take the ultimate insight she takes from Kierkegaard here, and I think this is related to Dina's question, related before, is that he was a religious man in an irreligious world, and he was, as a result, aware of, in a way that few people have been, of the utter despair of the world, right? This is on page 46. You know, if indeed one can still use that pallid, now almost meaningless term to describe an attitude of despair towards one's own existence and the basic principles of one's own scientific or scholarly field. What was important, she says a couple lines down at the bottom of page 46, is that Kierkegaard was the first thinker to live in a world constituted much like our own, that is, in a wholly secularized world stemming from the Enlightenment. I mean, that's an extraordinary statement to make. I don't know if she's going to defend that. The first thinker to live in the Enlightenment, in a world constituted by the Enlightenment. In its polemic, Kierkegaard's unconditionally religious life had to deal with just about the same world we are living in today. So she's making that connection. And what she finds is that in such a world as we're living in today, the difference between Protestantism and Catholicism, she says, pale in comparison with the gigantic abyss that has opened up between a self-contained atheistic world and a religious existence in that same world. To be radically religious in such a world means to be alone, not only in the sense that one stands alone before God, but also in the sense that no one else stands before God. I mean, this is extraordinary writing, and this is profoundly impactful for what Arendt understands thinking to be, which is to stand alone before God, or if you don't want to take God out of it, before fate, and also to be, in a sense, be the only one standing alone. I take that to be the argument, I guess, that argument that I was having with Sam and Dina to some degree, that for Arendt, thinking is about, in a large measure, standing alone, and that that can come through many ways, but it can come through capitalism, it can come through against capitalism, it can come through communism potentially, although she doesn't, I don't think she thinks so. But in any case, the great debate in our world is not between Protestantism or capitalism, or Protestant or Catholicism. And I would say, similarly for Arendt, the great debate is not between capitalism and socialism. I don't think she sees those as important distinctions. The debate is between a world that is radically atheistic and one that is, in some sense, inspired by the magic of thought. The debate is between one that is economically driven, whether capitalist or socialist, and one that is open to standing alone by oneself before God. Those to me are the Arendtian questions. And so, you know, the threat of the pandemic, if I understand it, is that it so focuses us on life, on what she would call the sort of social conditions, that it makes it almost impossible for people to have a space for thinking. So I don't know if that helps or not. I think that was an attempt to bring things back together. I'm going to let Anita have the last question. I know we're over time, but why not? There's one more question. Let's let it come out. Anita, you want to ask a question?
Yeah, thanks. I'll try and keep it short because it's over time. I don't know if my reading of the Kierkegaard essay is valid, but what really resonated with me was where she explores the reason why the reasons behind his posthumous fame. And at the top of page 45, she talks about the most important reason why he wasn't recognized earlier was the intellectual and cultural climate in Germany was not hospitable to him. There was a sort of a complacency and a self-assurance that wouldn't allow his unsettled message in. And one of the things that struck me, it sort of resonated with what she was saying in the previous the chapter we read last week, where she talks about her alienation of with the intellectual and her turn to the activist. And I'm wondering if this was something, this sort of semi-disillusionment questioning of the intellectual environment actually goes earlier than the Nazi era into the 1930s when she wrote this. Does it carry on throughout her life? Is there an uneasy relationship with the intellectual world, while at the same time being part of it?
Thanks, Anita. Well, it certainly carries on through the rest of her life into the future. I mean, she has a very uneasy relationship with intellectuals. I mean, she's writing against, I mean, her last few essays are deeply, I mean, I don't want to say this, anti-intellectual is probably the wrong word, but she is scurrilously charging intellectuals with crimes in 1967, 1971, 72, in some of her latest essays. So yes, it certainly does continue till then. Again, not against thinking, not against thinkers, but against experts and intellectuals who think they have some special status in the world as a result of their professional training. You know, what you're talking about here in the Kierkegaard essay is a kind of version of that. I mean, German academic culture, even later, certainly, you know, has been, you know, I think there's exceptions to it now, but it's much more disciplinary and caught up in you know, you do this, you can't do that, disciplines than someone like Arendt would like. And what she's saying, I think, about Kierkegaard is quite simple, which is that where do you put him? I mean, he's a theologian, he's a philosopher, he's a poet. I mean, where do you put him? He doesn't really fit. He's not really talking about any particular discipline as it was recognized in pre-World War I Germany. And so he was just, why he was not read is because he didn't really fit in. You know, and he had to be prepared for. I mean, in a way, you can think of Arendt's work and how it's been accepted as almost a counter, right? I mean, where is our Arendt's work read today? I mean, on the one hand, it's now read in philosophy departments. It's read in political theory departments. That's probably where it was first sort of picked up and read. It's read in religious studies departments and Jewish studies departments. It's read in education schools, schools of education. It's read in gender studies. It's read in race studies. You know, and so you know, why, you know, people ask this question all the time, why is Hannah Arendt so popular today? You know, what happened? I mean, she wasn't that popular when she died. What's the source of her posthumous fame, as we say? As she might ask if she were writing an essay on Hannah Arendt for a couple of years, you know, now. And, you know, I don't have one answer to it, but one is that she fits this moment of where she takes from all these different areas of the world, the real world, the problems of the world, and thinks them through in a way that, I mean, to come back to the Mannheim essay, is untimely in a way, in the sense that it doesn't fit with the, it doesn't seek to ask the questions of education or totalitarianism or in typical disciplinary fashion. I mean, she's not a historian, she's not a philosopher. What is she? And this attempt to think and the creativity that comes from it is part of what allows so many people to claim Arendt for their own, and in ways that other people don't like. Right? I mean, she's become someone that people on the left, on the right, communists or socialists or whatever, capitalists, whatever, claim. And she seems, and that can look like a negative, like, well, there must be nothing there, or she's open to everybody. I don't think that's the case at all. I think what she is a very original thinker who escapes a lot of the boxes and the boundaries and the borders that have been put up over generations of academic and political thinking. And as a result, she's incredibly fertile and exciting for people to read. You know, at least in a lot of her essays. As we get into this book, I think you'll see more of that. I mean, I agree that these are, I mean, I find these very interesting essays, but they're harder to pull a lot of that out of. In any case, we are out of time, over time, but I want to thank you guys all for sticking with us. And very much look forward to seeing you next week. So for next week, we'll send out the email. And I think we're reading 3 more essays. I'm not positive, but you'll get it. There are again some shorter.
We're reading 3 more: Friedrich von Gentz, Berlin Salon, and On the Emancipation of Women. So 3 very interesting essays. The only essay actually where Arendt deals with feminism head on, and an essay she wrote for the 100th publication, 100th Jahreszeit for Rahel Varnhagen. So.
Yeah. So those of you who've read the Rahel Varnhagen book on your own or with us, that'll be an interesting essay to read as well. And then The Emancipation of Women. So next week, enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. Thank you all, and we'll see you next week. Thanks very much.